My name is Dante Castellano. I'm an air traffic controller who survived the first 3 weeks of the Ice Age apocalypse from my tower at Denver International Airport. When Yellowstone erupted and blocked out the sun, I watched civilization freeze to death while coordinating the last rescue efforts over radio. I had to choose between finding my missing sister and saving 30 strangers trapped in the endless winter. This is how I became the final voice guiding survivors through a world that will never be warm again. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Dante Castellano, and what I'm about to tell you happened 3 weeks ago, but it feels like a lifetime. I was working the night shift at Denver International Airport when the world ended, not with a bang, not with sirens, but with snowflakes falling in September. September 29th started like any other Thursday night shift. I'd been guiding aircraft through Denver's airspace for 12 years, and the routine had become second nature. Clock in at 11 p.m., check the weather reports, review the overnight flight schedule, grab a coffee from the machine down the hall that always dispensed it too hot. The control tower at Denver International sits 327 feet above the ground, and from up there the world looks manageable. Organized. Every blinking light has a purpose. Every radio transmission follows protocol. Every aircraft moves exactly where it's supposed to go. That night I had 37 scheduled arrivals and departures between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m., mostly cargo flights and red-eyes from the West Coast. United had 3 late arrivals coming in, from Seattle, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. FedEx had their usual overnight freight runs, a handful of private jets carrying executives who preferred flying in the quiet hours when airports weren't packed with travelers. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested I was about to witness the collapse of everything I knew. I remember calling my sister Maria around 10:30, just before my shift started. She lived in Boulder with her 2 kids, 8-year-old Sophia and 10-year-old Miguel. We'd made plans for me to drive up Saturday afternoon to watch Miguel's soccer game and help Sophia with a science project about weather patterns. The irony of that isn't lost on me now. Maria was worried about Miguel's cough and whether she should keep him home from school Friday. Normal concerns. The kind of problems that seem laughable now but felt important then. The first hour of my shift was routine. American Airlines Flight 1207 from Phoenix requested clearance for approach at 11:45. I guided them to runway 34 left, watched their landing lights cut through the darkness, confirmed their safe arrival. Southwest had a departure delay due to a minor mechanical issue, nothing serious. The overnight freight runs were proceeding on schedule. I monitored weather conditions across the region, noting a high-pressure system moving in from the west that might affect morning departures. Standard stuff. Around midnight, I started getting the first unusual reports. Not emergency calls, just minor anomalies that caught my attention because they seemed connected. A United pilot reported slight turbulence over western Colorado that wasn't showing up on my weather radar. A FedEx captain mentioned visibility issues near Grand Junction that meteorology hadn't forecasted. Private jet, November 7-8 Mike, requested altitude adjustment due to what the pilot described as atmospheric disturbance. Each report by itself meant nothing. Air traffic controllers deal with unexpected weather conditions constantly. But something about the pattern felt wrong. I pulled up the regional weather data and noticed readings that didn't make sense. Barometric. Pressure dropping rapidly across western Colorado and southern Wyoming. Temperature variations that seemed too extreme for the season. Wind patterns that suggested major atmospheric disruption, but from no identifiable source. I called down to meteorology and spoke with Janet, who'd been working overnight weather for 15 years. She confirmed the readings were unusual but had no explanation. Satellite imagery wasn't showing any major storm systems that could account for the conditions pilots were reporting. By 1 a.m., the reports were becoming more frequent and more concerning. Delta Flight 43 from Salt Lake City reported severe turbulence at 35,000 feet over Glenwood Springs. The pilot's voice carried a tension I'd rarely heard in my years of radio communication. He described the aircraft as being thrown around like it hit an invisible wall of air. I cleared them for emergency descent and priority landing, but they managed to stabilize and continued their approach normally. That's when I started monitoring emergency frequencies more closely. Fire departments and police across western Colorado were reporting unusual seismic activity. Nothing major, just enough ground movement to trigger sensitive equipment and worry people who lived in areas where earthquakes were rare. The National Weather Service was issuing advisories about rapidly changing atmospheric conditions, but couldn't provide specifics about what was causing them. Around 1:30 a.m., I received a call that changed everything. The voice belonged to Captain Richards, a veteran pilot I'd worked with dozens of times flying cargo routes between Denver and Seattle. His aircraft was about 2 hours out maintaining course and altitude when he contacted me with a report that made my blood run cold. Captain Richards told me he was observing what appeared to be a massive volcanic eruption in the distance. His exact words were that it looked like someone had set off a nuclear bomb on the horizon, but instead of a mushroom cloud, there was an enormous column of ash and debris shooting straight up into the atmosphere. He estimated the column was reaching heights of over 60,000 feet and spreading horizontally in all directions. The ash cloud was so dense it was blocking out stars across a significant portion of the sky. I immediately contacted air traffic control centers in Salt Lake City and Cheyenne to verify the report. Both facilities confirmed they were receiving similar observations from multiple aircraft. Emergency management agencies across the region were being notified. The Federal Aviation Administration was preparing to issue a ground stop for all aircraft in the affected area. Then someone said the word that made everything real: Yellowstone. The Yellowstone caldera had erupted. Not the kind of minor eruption that happens periodically and makes news for a few days. This was what scientists call a super eruption, the kind of geological event that happens maybe once every 600,000 years. The kind that can change global climate patterns and affect civilizations across continents. The kind we'd all heard about in documentaries but never seriously considered as something that could happen in our lifetimes. Within minutes, every frequency I monitored was flooding with emergency traffic. Aircraft across the western United States were requesting immediate course changes to avoid the expanding ash cloud. Emergency management coordinators were declaring disasters across multiple states. The National Weather Service was issuing alerts warning about potential atmospheric effects extending far beyond the immediate eruption zone. I spent the next 3 hours coordinating emergency landings and route diversions as pilots desperately tried to navigate around the expanding disaster. The ash cloud was growing faster than anyone had predicted, spreading across Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Montana with a speed that defied every computer model. Aircraft that had been safely distant from the eruption zone suddenly found themselves flying into conditions that could destroy their engines within minutes. The most challenging part wasn't the technical coordination. I'd trained for mass casualty events and complex emergency scenarios. The hardest part was listening to the voices of pilots who were beginning to understand what they were witnessing. These were experienced aviators who'd flown through thunderstorms, ice storms, and every kind of severe weather condition imaginable. But the tone in their voices as they described the ash cloud told me this was something entirely different. Something that would fundamentally change how we understood the world we lived in. By 4 a.m., Denver International was receiving aircraft from across the western United States. Flights that had been bound for Salt Lake City, Bozeman, Cheyenne, and Colorado Springs were all being diverted to Denver because we were still outside the immediate ashfall zone. The terminal was filling with stranded passengers who had no idea their flights had just become refugee evacuations. Ground crews were working frantically to accommodate aircraft that weren't scheduled to be there, finding gate space and coordinating services for planes and passengers that had essentially fled a natural disaster. I called Maria around 4:30 to warn her about what was happening. The phone lines were already becoming congested as news of the eruption spread, but I managed to get through. I explained that there had been a major volcanic eruption at Yellowstone and that she should monitor emergency broadcasts for potential evacuation orders. She asked if she and the kids were in danger, and I told her the truth. I didn't know. The ash cloud was moving east, but meteorologists were struggling to predict exactly where it would go and how severe the effects would be in different areas. Maria's response was typical of her practical nature. She said she'd fill the bathtub with water, make sure They had enough food for several days and keep the car fueled in case they needed to evacuate quickly. She asked if I was safe in the tower, and I assured her that for the moment, yes. The airport had backup power systems, emergency supplies, and communication equipment that would keep functioning even if local infrastructure was disrupted. What I didn't tell her was that I was starting to realize the magnitude of what we were facing. The meteorological data I was receiving painted a picture that was almost too frightening to process. The ash column had reached heights of over 80,000 feet and was spreading across the upper atmosphere at speeds that would carry it around the globe within days. Computer models were predicting significant temperature drops across North America as the ash blocked solar radiation. Agricultural experts were already discussing the potential for crop failures across the continent's grain belt, but the most disturbing information was coming from volcanologists who were providing emergency briefings to aviation authorities. They were describing this eruption as potentially the largest geological event in recorded human history. The amount of ash and sulfur dioxide being ejected into the atmosphere was comparable to eruptions that had caused global climate disruption in the past. They were using terms like volcanic winter and discussing timeframes measured in years rather than months. By 5 a.m., the first effects were becoming visible from my position in the tower. The western horizon, which should have been showing the first hints of dawn, remained completely dark. Instead of the gradual lightening that precedes sunrise, there was an ominous red glow that seemed to pulse and shift as massive quantities of ash and debris continued pouring into the atmosphere. The air itself was beginning to take on a hazy quality that made distant lights appear dimmer and less distinct. Aircraft continuing to arrive at Denver were reporting increasingly severe conditions. Pilots described flying through ash clouds that reduced visibility to near zero and caused static electricity to build up on their aircraft. Several flights reported minor engine problems that could have been catastrophic if they'd encountered heavier concentrations of volcanic ash. The FAA was preparing to implement a total flight ban across the western United States as soon as current aircraft could be safely landed. Around 5:30 a.m., I received the weather report that confirmed my worst fears. The National Weather Service was forecasting a temperature drop of 15 to 20 degrees across Colorado within the next 24 to 48 hours. That might not sound dramatic, but September 30th in Denver typically sees daytime temperatures in the 70s. A 20-degree drop would mean highs in the 50s and overnight lows potentially reaching freezing, and this was just the beginning. The meteorologist I spoke with explained that the ash cloud was acting like a giant umbrella, blocking solar radiation from reaching the Earth's surface. As long as the ash remained in the upper atmosphere, temperatures would continue to drop. Computer models were suggesting that if the eruption continued at its current intensity, some regions could see temperatures drop by 30 to 40 degrees below normal within a week. That's when I first started seeing what I thought were small, white specks on the terminal windows. At first I assumed it was dust or debris being blown around by the wind, but as I watched more carefully, I realized what I was seeing was snow. Not the heavy, wet snow of a winter storm, but light, dry flakes that seemed to drift rather than fall. Snow in late September in Denver isn't impossible, but it's unusual enough to be noteworthy. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a curiosity worth mentioning to colleagues. But these weren't normal circumstances. The snow continued throughout the early morning hours, gradually becoming heavier and more persistent. By 6 a.m., there was a visible accumulation on surfaces outside the terminal. Aircraft parked on the tarmac were developing a thin white coating. Ground crews were beginning to implement winter weather procedures that shouldn't have been necessary for another 2 months. I managed to reach Maria again around 6:15. The phone connection was worse this time, with static and intermittent breaks that suggested communication infrastructure was beginning to be affected by the atmospheric conditions. She told me it was snowing in Boulder too, and that the kids were excited because they thought they might get a snow day from school. I had to explain that school might be canceled for reasons that had nothing to do with fun. During that conversation, I made what I now realize was one of the most important decisions of my life. I told Maria that if conditions continued to deteriorate, she should consider evacuating Boulder and driving south toward Colorado Springs or even New Mexico. I suggested she pack essential supplies and important documents in case they needed to leave quickly. At the time, I thought I was being overly cautious. Now I know I was probably being too optimistic about how much time she would have. The last hour of my shift brought a series of events that made it clear this was no ordinary natural disaster. Commercial aviation across the western United States had essentially ceased to exist. The last scheduled passenger flight I guided to a landing was United Airlines Flight 1847 from Seattle, arriving at 6:43 a.m. The pilot reported that Seattle-Tacoma International Airport had been closed due to ash accumulation on runways, and that volcanic ash was falling across western Washington state. By 7 a.m., when my replacement should have arrived for the day shift, it was clear that normal operations were no longer possible. My colleague Dave called to say he couldn't make it to the airport because his car wouldn't start in the unexpected. Cold and road conditions were becoming hazardous due to the snow accumulation. The day shift supervisor contacted me to say that, given the circumstances, anyone willing and able to remain on duty should do so until the situation stabilized. I agreed to stay, not because I particularly wanted to work a double shift, but because I was beginning to understand that the expertise I'd developed over 12 years of air traffic control might be desperately needed. Aircraft were still airborne across the country, trying to find safe places to land as airports closed and weather conditions deteriorated. Emergency flights were beginning to operate, carrying essential personnel and supplies to areas affected by the eruption. Someone needed to coordinate these operations, and I was qualified to do it. What I didn't fully grasp at the time was that by agreeing to stay in that tower, I was committing myself to witnessing the end of the world as I'd known it. Over the following hours and days, I would watch civilization struggle and ultimately fail to cope with a disaster of unprecedented magnitude. I would guide aircraft carrying the last evacuees from doomed cities. I would coordinate emergency supplies for communities that would ultimately be abandoned. I would become a communication link between survivors scattered across a landscape that was transforming into something unrecognizable. The snow continued falling throughout the morning, gradually changing from light flakes to heavy, wet precipitation that accumulated rapidly on every surface. By 8 a.m., there were already 2 inches on the ground, and the accumulation rate was accelerating. The temperature had dropped from the mid-60s at midnight to the upper 30s by 8 a.m. Weather forecasters were predicting continued cooling throughout the day, with overnight temperatures potentially reaching the teens. Aircraft operations at Denver International had essentially ceased except for emergency and military flights. The few remaining commercial flights were either being canceled or diverted to airports further east that weren't yet experiencing severe weather conditions. Ground crews were working to secure aircraft and equipment against conditions they weren't prepared for, trying to prevent damage that could make recovery efforts even more difficult once the immediate crisis passed. But perhaps the most disturbing development was the realization that this was happening simultaneously across a massive geographic area. Radio communications with other airports and emergency management centers revealed that similar conditions were developing from Montana to New Mexico, from Nevada to Nebraska. The ash cloud had spread far beyond what anyone had initially predicted, carrying with it weather effects that were transforming the climate across the entire western half of North America. By 9 a.m., I was coordinating with emergency management, agencies that were implementing disaster response protocols on a scale never before attempted. Entire metropolitan areas were being prepared for potential evacuation. Agricultural regions were implementing emergency procedures to protect livestock and salvage crops before they were destroyed by unseasonable weather. Transportation networks were being modified to handle population movements that could involve millions of people. I called Maria one more time before the phone systems became too unreliable for consistent communication. The connection was poor, filled with static and frequent interruptions, but I could hear the worry in her voice. She told me the snow in Boulder was already 6 inches deep and still falling heavily. The power had flickered several times, and neighbors were talking about driving south to stay with relatives in warmer areas. I told her not to wait. I said that if she had any doubt about her safety or the kids' safety, she should pack immediately and drive south. I gave her specific route recommendations based on weather data I was receiving, suggesting she take Highway 25 south through Colorado Springs and continue toward New Mexico if necessary. I told her to take cash, important documents, warm clothing, and enough food and water for several days of travel. That was the last normal conversation I had with my sister. Not because anything dramatic happened immediately afterward, but because the world we'd both known was disappearing so rapidly that by the time we spoke again, we were different people living in a different reality. By 10 a.m. on September 30th, I understood 3 things that would define everything that happened afterward. First, the Yellowstone eruption was not a temporary crisis that would be resolved in days or weeks. The volcanic activity was continuing, pumping enormous quantities of ash and gases into the atmosphere at a rate that would affect global weather patterns for months or possibly years. Second, the immediate effects on regional climate were more severe and developing more rapidly than any expert had predicted. We weren't facing an unusually harsh winter. We were facing a fundamental shift in environmental conditions that would make survival challenging for millions of people. Third, the infrastructure and systems that modern civilization depends on were not designed to handle this type of rapid extreme change. As I prepared to continue coordinating emergency operations from my position in the tower, I realized I was no longer just an air traffic controller doing his job during an unusual situation. I had become a witness to and participant in one of the most significant disasters in human history. The routine world of scheduled flights and standard procedures had been replaced by something unprecedented, and my role was evolving from managing normal operations to helping coordinate survival efforts. The snow was still falling, the temperature was still dropping, and the ash-darkened sky showed no signs of clearing. Communication systems were becoming less reliable as atmospheric conditions interfered with radio transmissions and power systems struggled with unexpected demand. But aircraft were still flying, carrying people and supplies that could mean the difference between life and death for communities across the region. I settled in for what I expected would be a long day of emergency coordination, not knowing that I was actually beginning 3 weeks of the most intense and consequential work of my life. 3 weeks during which I would help save lives and watch others die, coordinate rescues and witness failures, maintain hope while accepting that the world was changing in ways that couldn't be reversed. By October 4th, I understood 3 things. The snow wasn't going to stop. The temperature wasn't going to rise, and I was about to become something I never trained for. The last voice some people would ever hear. October 5th marked the beginning of the silence. Not the peaceful quiet you might imagine, but the kind of silence that screams at you. The absence of everything that once meant civilization was still functioning. The last regular commercial flight departed Denver International at 11:23 p.m. on October 4th. Southwest Airlines Flight 2406 to Phoenix, carrying 47 passengers who had no idea they were among the final people to experience normal air travel for what might be months or years. I watched their navigation, lights disappear into the ash-darkened sky, knowing I might never guide another scheduled passenger flight again. By October 5th, the Federal Aviation Administration had officially suspended all commercial aviation operations west of the Mississippi River. The ash cloud had spread so extensively that instrument approaches were becoming impossible at most airports. Engine failures from volcanic ash ingestion were being reported across multiple aircraft types. Insurance companies were refusing to cover flights into affected areas. The economic machinery that keeps airlines operating had simply stopped working. From my position in the control tower, I could see the transformation happening in real time. Denver International Airport, which normally handled over 1,500 aircraft movements per day, had become a graveyard of stranded planes. Jetliners sat motionless on taxiways, their engines covered with protective barriers against the ash that continued falling like gray snow. Ground support vehicles moved slowly between aircraft, their operators wearing masks and goggles against the increasingly toxic air. The snow that had started as a curiosity was now a relentless presence. 12 inches had accumulated by October 5th, with no sign of stopping. But this wasn't normal snow. Mixed with volcanic ash, it had a gritty texture that made it heavier and more destructive than pure precipitation. The weight was causing structural problems for buildings not designed to handle such loads. Airport maintenance crews were working around the clock to prevent roof collapses in the terminal buildings. Temperature readings were becoming more frightening each day. October 5th saw a high of 28 degrees and a low of 14 in early October. These were temperatures Denver typically didn't see until January, and we were still in what should have been mild autumn weather. Weather forecasters had stopped making predictions beyond 24 hours because their computer models couldn't process the unprecedented atmospheric conditions. My daily routine had evolved into something I'd never trained for. Instead of coordinating scheduled flights, I was managing emergency operations across a region where normal transportation had ceased to exist. Military aircraft were still flying, carrying essential supplies and personnel to communities that were becoming isolated as roads became impassable. Medical evacuation helicopters were operating when weather conditions permitted, transferring critical patients from hospitals that were losing power and running out of supplies. The psychological challenge was becoming as difficult as the technical aspects of my job. Every radio transmission I received carried desperation that was hard to process. Pilots reporting fuel shortages as airports ran out of aviation gas. Emergency medical crews requesting transport for patients who couldn't survive in facilities without reliable heating. Government officials coordinating evacuations of entire communities that could no longer sustain themselves. October 6th brought the first major infrastructure failure that directly affected my operations. The main power grid serving Denver International Airport experienced a cascading failure around 2 p.m. when ash accumulation caused short circuits across multiple transmission lines simultaneously. Backup generators activated automatically, but the sudden transition interrupted radio communications for nearly 10 minutes. 10 minutes during which aircraft in flight couldn't reach me for guidance, and emergency operations across the region lost their primary coordination hub. The power outage revealed how dependent our entire system had become on technologies that weren't designed for the conditions we were now facing. Radio equipment that worked perfectly under normal circumstances was struggling with atmospheric interference from the ash cloud. Computer systems were overheating because ventilation systems couldn't filter out the fine particles that penetrated even sealed buildings. Communication networks were failing as relay towers lost power and couldn't be safely accessed for repairs. During those 10 minutes of communication blackout, I experienced a level of helplessness I'd never felt before. Aircraft were still flying, out there, carrying people whose lives depended on my guidance, and I couldn't reach them. Emergency responders were coordinating life-or-death operations that required precise timing and communication, and the link had been severed. I realized how fragile the entire system was, and how quickly everything we took for granted could disappear. When power was restored and communications came back online, the backlog of emergency traffic was overwhelming. 5 aircraft had been trying to reach me for approach clearances. 3 medical evacuation helicopters needed weather updates for flights that couldn't be delayed. Emergency management coordinators from 6 different counties were requesting updates on supply flights that were carrying materials needed to prevent humanitarian disasters. That evening, I tried calling Maria but couldn't get through. The phone lines were overwhelmed with emergency traffic, and residential service was being deprioritized to keep government and medical communications functioning. When I finally reached a working line around 8 p.m., the connection was so poor I could barely understand what she was saying. Through the static, I could make out that they were still in Boulder, that the power had been out for 6 hours, and that snow was continuing to accumulate at a rate that was making travel impossible. I wanted to tell her to leave immediately, to get in the car and drive south before conditions got worse. But the truth was that travel had already become extremely dangerous. Highway reports were describing whiteout conditions, multiple vehicle accidents, and road closures across the entire region. The Colorado Department of Transportation was advising against all non-essential travel, and even emergency vehicles were having difficulty navigating the deteriorating conditions. October 7th was when the silence truly began. That morning, I lost contact with air traffic control facilities in Salt Lake City, Cheyenne, and Colorado Springs, not because of equipment failures on my end, but because those facilities had been evacuated or were no longer operational. The network of communication and coordination that had connected aviation operations across the western United States was fragmenting as individual locations became isolated by the worsening conditions. The phone system failure that day was total and permanent. Around noon, I tried calling Maria and got nothing but a recording saying that all circuits were busy. By evening, even that recording was gone, replaced by silence that meant the entire telecommunication infrastructure had been overwhelmed or damaged beyond its capacity to function. The last link I had to my sister and her children had been severed, leaving me with no way to know if they were safe, if they'd evacuated, or if they needed help I couldn't provide. The psychological impact of losing contact with family during a disaster is something you can't prepare for. Every aircraft I guided to safety, every successful coordination of emergency supplies, every life I helped save through my work in the tower was shadowed by the knowledge that I couldn't help the people who mattered most to me. The professional obligation to remain at my post and coordinate operations that were saving lives across the region was in constant conflict with the personal desire to abandon everything and search for my family. But abandoning my post wasn't really an option. By October 7th, I was one of the few remaining air traffic controllers operating in the entire region. Aircraft were still flying, carrying supplies and personnel for operations that were keeping people alive. Medical evacuation flights were still operating when weather permitted, transferring patients from facilities that were failing to hospitals that still had power and supplies. Military transport aircraft were delivering food, fuel, and emergency equipment to communities that were becoming completely isolated. The weather conditions were deteriorating faster than anyone had predicted. October 7th saw a high temperature of 18 degrees and a low of -4 degrees in early October. The snow accumulation was approaching 2 feet, but the real problem was that it wasn't melting at all. Each day brought additional accumulation on top of what had already fallen, creating a building weight load that was causing structural failures across the region. Aircraft operations were becoming increasingly dangerous. Pilots were reporting that runway conditions were at the limits of what was safe for landing, even with continuous snow removal efforts. Deicing equipment was running out of chemicals, needed to keep aircraft surfaces clear of ice accumulation. Ground support vehicles were breaking down as their engines struggled with the extreme cold and contaminated air filters. The types of flights I was coordinating had changed completely from normal operations. Instead of passenger airlines following published schedules, I was managing emergency operations that operated more like military missions. Supply flights carrying heating fuel to hospitals and nursing homes. Evacuation flights removing critical patients and essential personnel from facilities that could no longer function safely. Search and rescue operations looking for people who'd become stranded or lost in conditions that were rapidly becoming unsurvivable. Each successful operation felt significant in a way that routine air traffic control never had. When I guided a medical evacuation helicopter safely through deteriorating weather conditions to pick up a patient who needed surgery, I knew that my decisions directly determined whether that person lived or died. When I coordinated the approach of a cargo aircraft carrying emergency supplies to a community that was running out of food and fuel, I was helping prevent a humanitarian disaster that could affect hundreds of people. But the failures were becoming more frequent and more devastating. October 8th brought the first aircraft accident directly related to the volcanic winter conditions. A small private plane attempting to evacuate a family from a rural area in western Colorado crashed during approach to an emergency landing strip. The pilot had been trying to navigate through visibility conditions that were beyond what his instruments could handle. I'd been providing guidance based on weather data that was hours old, because real-time reporting systems were no longer functioning in that area. The family died in that crash. 2 adults and 3 children who'd been trying to reach safety, guided by a pilot who was risking his own life to help strangers. I'd coordinated that flight, provided the weather briefing, cleared them for approach to what I thought was a safe landing area. The knowledge that my guidance had contributed to their deaths was something I struggled to process while continuing to coordinate other emergency operations. October 9th marked 1 week since the last normal day I could remember. The infrastructure systems that modern civilization depends on were failing faster than they could be repaired or replaced. Power grids were experiencing rolling blackouts as demand for heating increased while generating capacity decreased due to equipment failures and fuel shortages. Water treatment. Facilities were struggling to operate without reliable electricity and with filtration systems clogged by volcanic ash. Communication systems were fragmenting into isolated networks that couldn't reliably connect with each other. My radio equipment in the control tower was still functioning, but I was losing contact with facilities and operations across an increasingly wide area. Emergency management coordinators who'd been providing regular updates were going silent, as their communications equipment failed or their facilities were evacuated. The scope of the disaster was becoming clear through fragments of information I could gather from military communications and emergency broadcasts. The volcanic ash cloud had circled the globe, causing temperature drops and agricultural disruption on multiple continents. Food production in major agricultural regions was being severely affected by unseasonable weather and reduced sunlight. Transportation networks were failing as fuel supplies became limited, and weather conditions made travel increasingly dangerous. Supply chains that had seemed robust and reliable were proving to be extremely fragile when faced with widespread disruption. Grocery stores were running out of food because delivery trucks couldn't navigate the road conditions. Gas stations were closing because fuel deliveries weren't getting through. Hospitals were rationing supplies because the just-in-time inventory systems that had seemed efficient under normal conditions provided no buffer for extended emergencies. The human cost was becoming visible even from my isolated position in the control tower. Emergency radio traffic included increasing reports of people found dead from exposure, carbon monoxide poisoning from improper heating, and medical emergencies that couldn't be treated because transport to hospitals was impossible. Communities that had seemed well prepared for winter weather were discovering that their preparations were inadequate for conditions this extreme and prolonged. By October 9th, I was coordinating operations across a region where normal society had essentially ceased to function. Aircraft were still flying, but they were carrying supplies and personnel for disaster response rather than normal commercial or personal travel. Ground transportation was limited to emergency vehicles with specialized equipment for extreme weather conditions. Most businesses had closed because employees couldn't travel to work and customers couldn't reach them safely. The weather forecast for October 10th predicted continued snow, temperatures dropping into negative double digits, and wind conditions that would make aircraft operations extremely dangerous. I was preparing for the possibility that even emergency flights might become too risky to continue, which would leave isolated communities completely cut off from outside assistance. That night I managed to establish brief radio contact with an amateur radio operator in Boulder, who confirmed that the city was experiencing the same extreme conditions as Denver. Power was intermittent, food supplies were running low, and many residents had already evacuated south toward areas that were still marginally habitable. He couldn't provide specific information about Maria and the kids, but confirmed that the neighborhood where they lived had been largely abandoned as people fled to areas with better infrastructure and milder weather. The knowledge that my family was somewhere out there, possibly struggling to survive in conditions I could monitor but couldn't affect, was becoming harder to bear with each passing day. Every successful rescue operation I coordinated reminded me that I couldn't rescue the people who mattered most to me. Every supply flight I guided to safety highlighted the fact that I didn't know if my sister and her children had access to the food, fuel, and shelter they needed to survive. October 10th brought weather conditions that pushed aircraft operations beyond the limits of safety. Visibility was near zero due to blowing snow and ash. Wind gusts were exceeding the maximum safe limits for most aircraft types. Ground temperatures were so low that standard desing procedures were no longer effective. I made the decision to suspend all but the most critical emergency flights, knowing that this would leave some communities completely isolated, but also knowing that attempting flights in these conditions would likely result in more casualties. The silence that followed that decision was different from the communication blackouts I'd experienced before. This was the silence of a system that had reached its limits and could no longer function. Aircraft weren't flying because it was too dangerous. Ground vehicles weren't moving because roads were impassable. People weren't traveling because survival required staying wherever they had shelter and heat. From my position in the control tower, I could see Denver International Airport, completing its transformation from a hub of global transportation to an abandoned facility that would probably remain non-functional for months. Snowdrifts were building against terminal buildings. Aircraft were becoming buried under accumulating precipitation that would take weeks to remove even if conditions improved. The runways that I'd been using to guide aircraft to safety were disappearing under a blanket of white that showed no signs of stopping. But even as normal operations became impossible, my role was evolving into something I'd never expected. Amateur radio operators across the region were beginning to use aviation frequencies to coordinate survival efforts. People with emergency communications equipment were establishing networks that could relay information between isolated communities. My position in the control tower, with its powerful radio equipment and elevated location, was becoming a communication hub for survivors who were trying to maintain contact with each other and coordinate mutual aid. By October 10th, I realized I wasn't just an air traffic controller anymore. I was a lighthouse keeper in a sea of ice, and the ships trying to reach shore were carrying the last remnants of the world I used to know. October 10th was when I stopped thinking like someone waiting for rescue and started thinking like someone who had become the rescue. The difference between those two mindsets is what separates survivors from casualties. That morning brought the first radio transmission that changed everything. A family trapped in Arvada, about 15 miles southeast of the airport, had managed to establish contact using a handheld amateur radio they'd found in their neighbor's garage. The father's voice came through the static around 7 a.m., weak and desperate, asking if anyone could hear them. They'd been without power for 4 days, were running out of food, and their house was losing heat faster than their fireplace could provide it. I responded immediately, establishing communication protocols that would become standard for all the survivor contacts that followed. First, I confirmed their location and assessed their immediate survival needs. Then I evaluated what resources and options were available based on my knowledge of conditions across the region. Finally, I provided specific guidance for improving their situation while maintaining regular contact to monitor their progress. The Arvada family's situation was representative of thousands of people across the metro area. They were in a suburban house designed for normal winter weather, not the extreme conditions we were experiencing. Their heating system depended on natural gas service that had become intermittent as pipeline infrastructure struggled with the unprecedented demand and equipment failures. They had enough food for perhaps another 3 days if they rationed carefully, but no way to obtain more because local stores were either closed or inaccessible. Using my position in the control tower, I could see weather patterns and conditions across a much wider area than people on the ground could observe. I guided them to a nearby elementary school that had been designated as an emergency shelter and still had backup power from diesel generators. The route I provided avoided areas where I knew roads were completely blocked and took them through neighborhoods where other survivors had reported safe passage. That successful coordination became the template for operations that would define the next phase of my role in this disaster. I wasn't just managing aircraft anymore because aircraft operations had essentially ceased. Instead, I was using air traffic control skills to coordinate ground-based survival efforts across a region where normal communication and transportation systems had failed. By October 11th, I was maintaining regular contact with 7 different survivor groups scattered across the Denver metropolitan area. Each group faced unique challenges based on their location, resources, and the number of people they were trying to keep alive. My role had evolved into something like an emergency management coordinator, but operating from a single fixed position with limited information and no direct authority over the people I was trying to help. The technical challenges were significant. My radio equipment was designed for aircraft communication, not ground-based emergency coordination. The frequencies I was authorized to use weren't necessarily the ones that survivor groups could access with whatever equipment they'd managed to find. Atmospheric conditions caused by the ash cloud created interference that made communication difficult and sometimes impossible for hours at a time. But the psychological challenges were even more complex. People in extreme survival situations don't always make rational decisions, and providing guidance to desperate people required skills I'd never been trained for. I had to balance honesty about dangerous conditions with the need to maintain hope that kept people motivated to continue survival efforts. I had to provide technical advice about situations I couldn't directly observe, knowing that incorrect guidance could result in deaths. The Westminster family I made contact with on October 11th illustrated these challenges perfectly. They were a couple in their 70s with limited mobility, trapped in a house where the heating system had failed completely. The husband had diabetes and was rationing insulin that would run out within days. Their adult children lived in other states and had no way to reach them because long-distance travel had become impossible. Traditional emergency response would have involved sending an ambulance or rescue team to evacuate them to a medical facility, but ambulances weren't operating because road conditions were too dangerous, and medical facilities were overwhelmed with patients they couldn't discharge because there was nowhere safe to send them. Instead, I had to help them solve their problems, using only the resources available in their immediate area. I guided them through the process of creating a safer heating arrangement using their gas stove and oven, while emphasizing the critical importance of ventilation to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning. I connected them via radio with a neighbor who had medical supplies and could provide temporary assistance with the husband's diabetes management. I identified an abandoned pharmacy where they might be able to find additional insulin and provided route guidance for reaching it safely. These weren't solutions that would work under normal circumstances, but normal circumstances no longer existed. The entire framework of emergency response, medical care, and social support that we'd all taken for granted had broken down so completely that people had to improvise survival strategies using whatever resources they could find or access. October 12th brought my first major coordination success and my first devastating failure on the same day. The success involved connecting 3 separate survivor groups in the Lakewood area who were struggling with different but complementary problems. One group had adequate shelter and heating but was running out of food. Another had access to a grocery store that still had supplies but lacked the manpower to transport goods safely. The third group included someone with medical training who could provide care for a child in the first group who was developing symptoms of pneumonia. Using radio communication, I coordinated a supply and assistance exchange that solved multiple problems simultaneously. The group with transportation capability retrieved food from the accessible store and delivered it to the group that needed supplies. In exchange, they received medical care for their own members who were dealing with cold-related injuries. The medically trained person was able to treat the child with pneumonia using antibiotics found at the pharmacy, preventing what could have been a fatal infection. This coordination required hours of careful planning and communication. I had to relay messages between groups who couldn't communicate directly with each other, verify the safety of travel routes based on reports from other survivors, and help them plan logistics for operations that had to be completed quickly due to deteriorating weather conditions. The success felt like air traffic control in many ways, but instead of guiding aircraft through airspace, I was guiding people through a landscape that had become as dangerous and unpredictable as severe weather. The failure that same day involved a family in Golden who I'd been helping plan an evacuation to a better shelter. They'd been living in a house that was losing structural integrity due to the weight of accumulated snow and ash. I'd identified a route to a community center that had backup power and was housing other survivors. I'd coordinated with people at the destination to ensure they'd be welcomed and could contribute to the group's survival efforts. But the timing went wrong. Weather conditions deteriorated faster than forecast, and the family got caught in whiteout conditions that made navigation impossible. They became disoriented and ended up in an area where I knew the road was blocked by fallen trees and abandoned vehicles. I maintained radio contact with them for 6 hours as they tried to find shelter and wait for conditions to improve, but the temperature dropped to -18 degrees that night, and their car couldn't provide adequate protection. I found them the next morning, or rather, I coordinated the search effort that found them. They'd died of exposure less than 2 miles from safety, in a car that had run out of fuel while they waited for rescue that couldn't reach them in time. The father had used their radio's emergency battery power to send a final transmission, thanking me for trying to help them, even though my guidance had ultimately led them into the situation that killed them. Processing that failure while continuing to coordinate other survival efforts was one of the most difficult psychological challenges I'd faced. Every decision I made as a coordinator had life or death consequences, but I was making those decisions based on incomplete information and couldn't directly assist when things went wrong. The responsibility was overwhelming, but abandoning it would mean other people would die who might have been saved with proper guidance and coordination. October 13th brought the discovery that changed my understanding of what was happening beyond the immediate Denver area. I established contact with a ham radio operator in Colorado Springs, who had been monitoring emergency frequencies across the entire western United States. His reports confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. The disaster was far more widespread and severe than anyone had initially realized. According to his information, similar conditions were affecting areas from Montana to New Mexico, from Nevada to Kansas. Major cities, including Salt Lake City, Phoenix, and Albuquerque, were experiencing infrastructure failures and population evacuations. Agricultural areas across multiple states were facing complete crop losses that would affect food supplies nationwide. Transportation networks, including interstate highways and rail lines, were shut down across vast areas due to weather conditions and fuel shortages. But the most disturbing information was about the volcanic activity itself. Instead of diminishing, as many experts had initially hoped, the eruption was continuing at high intensity with no signs of stopping. Seismic monitoring stations that were still operational were reporting increased activity at other volcanic sites across the western United States. There were unconfirmed reports of secondary eruptions at smaller volcanic systems that were being triggered by the massive geological disruption at Yellowstone. This information fundamentally changed how I understood the situation we were facing. This wasn't a temporary disaster that would be resolved when emergency response systems could be restored and people could return to their normal lives. This was the beginning of a long-term transformation of environmental conditions that would require completely different survival strategies and social organization. The implications for the survivor groups I was coordinating were profound. Instead of planning for short-term survival until rescue arrived, we needed to develop strategies for long-term sustainability in conditions that might persist for months or years. Instead of rationing supplies to last until stores reopened, we needed to find ways to produce or obtain essentials on an ongoing basis. Instead of waiting for infrastructure to be repaired, we needed to create alternative systems for heating, communication, and transportation. October 14th brought the coordination challenge that tested every skill I'd developed since the disaster began. A group of 32 survivors scattered across 6 different locations in the metro area needed to be consolidated into a single, more sustainable shelter before winter conditions became completely unsurvivable. Each location had different advantages and disadvantages, and moving people between them required navigating through areas where travel was extremely dangerous. The target location was a community recreation center in Aurora that had geothermal heating, backup power systems, and enough space to house a larger group. More importantly, it was located near a warehouse district where food and supplies could potentially be scavenged from abandoned facilities. The building's construction was solid enough to handle heavy snow loads, and its location provided access to multiple transportation routes that might remain passable even in severe weather. Coordinating the movement of 32 people from 6 different starting points to a single destination required planning that was more complex than any air traffic control scenario I'd ever managed. I had to account for the different transportation capabilities of each group, the varying weather conditions they'd encounter at different times of day, the supplies and equipment they could carry, and the safety of multiple routes that might become impassable with little warning. The operation took 3 days to plan and execute. I coordinated schedules so that groups would arrive at the destination in an order that maximized safety and efficiency. I identified supply caches and shelter points along each route where people could rest or wait if conditions deteriorated. I established communication protocols that would allow me to track the progress of each group and coordinate assistance if problems developed. 28 of the 32 people reached the Aurora shelter safely. 4 people didn't make it. 2 elderly individuals couldn't handle the physical demands of the journey and died of exposure during the first night. A woman with diabetes went into ketoacidosis because the stress and cold affected her blood sugar control more severely than anyone had anticipated. A man suffered a heart attack while helping to carry supplies and couldn't be revived despite the efforts of others in his group. The deaths weighed heavily on me, but the alternative would have been worse. The scattered locations where these people had been sheltering were becoming increasingly unsustainable as fuel ran out, food supplies dwindled, and building systems failed. If they'd remained in those locations, most or all of them would have died within the next week or two. The consolidation saved more lives than it cost, but that statistical reality didn't make the failures any easier to accept. By October 14th, I was coordinating survival efforts for over 60 people across the region, while maintaining my position in the control tower that had become a communication hub for an area where all other coordination systems had failed. The role required skills that combined air traffic control expertise with emergency management, psychological counseling, resource allocation, and leadership abilities I'd never known I possessed. The technical infrastructure I was using was holding together, but barely. My radio equipment was functioning despite the harsh conditions, but backup power systems were consuming fuel at a rate that would exhaust my reserves within days. The generator that provided electricity for my communications equipment was running constantly because the main power grid had become completely unreliable and fuel deliveries were obviously no longer possible. The weather forecast for the following week predicted conditions that would make even the limited travel and coordination activities we'd been managing extremely dangerous or impossible. Temperatures were expected to drop into the -20s, with wind conditions that would create life-threatening exposure within minutes for anyone caught outside without proper protection. Snow accumulation was predicted to reach 4 feet in some areas, making ground travel virtually impossible for vehicles that weren't specifically designed for Arctic conditions. These forecasts meant that the window for large-scale coordination and movement of survivors was closing rapidly. Any groups that weren't in sustainable long-term shelter within the next few days would likely be trapped in their current locations until spring, assuming spring would bring conditions that allowed for renewed movement and communication. The psychological challenge of accepting that reality while continuing to coordinate immediate survival efforts was exhausting. Every decision had to balance short-term survival needs against long-term sustainability requirements. Every piece of guidance I provided had to account for the possibility that it might be the last assistance these people would receive for months. October 14th taught me that being a lifeline means sometimes you have to cut the rope to save the ship. I learned that night that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about choosing who else gets to stay alive with you. October 15th brought the message I'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. A crackling voice through the static claimed they'd seen my sister Maria and her kids. The problem was they were 50 miles away in conditions I knew were unsurvivable. The transmission came through around 6 a.m. on a frequency I'd been monitoring for emergency traffic. A man identifying himself as Robert from Golden said his group had encountered a woman and 2 children matching the description I'd been broadcasting during my daily attempts to locate my family. According to his report, they'd been seen 3 days earlier at a roadside rest stop on Highway 36, heading west toward the mountains with supplies that suggested they were attempting a long-distance evacuation. My first reaction was relief so intense it was almost painful. For 2 weeks, I'd been coordinating rescue efforts for dozens of strangers while having no information about whether my own family was alive or dead. The knowledge that Maria and the kids had been seen, alive as recently as 3 days ago, meant they'd survived the initial catastrophe and were actively trying to reach safety. But the relief lasted only until I processed the rest of Robert's information. Highway 36 west of Boulder led into mountainous terrain that was completely impassable under current weather conditions. If they'd continued in that direction, they would have encountered snow accumulations measured in feet, rather than inches, temperatures that dropped below -20 degrees at night, and elevations where exposure could be fatal within hours even with proper equipment. The location where they'd been spotted was approximately 50 miles from my position in the control tower. Under normal circumstances, that would represent perhaps an hour of highway driving. Under current conditions, it might as well have been 500 miles. The roads between Denver and Golden were blocked by abandoned vehicles, fallen trees, and snowdrifts that made passage impossible for anything except specialized winter equipment that I didn't have access to. But the real challenge wasn't the distance or the road conditions. The fundamental problem was that I'd become the communication hub and coordination center for survival efforts across the entire Denver metropolitan area. Over 60 people in multiple locations were depending on my guidance for everything from route planning to medical advice to resource allocation. If I abandoned my position to search for my family, those people would lose the coordination that was keeping them alive. The moral weight of that choice was crushing. Every instinct told me to leave immediately and search for Maria and the kids, regardless of the personal risk or the difficulty of the journey. They were my family, my responsibility, my motivation for everything I'd done since the disaster began. But they were also just 3 people among the dozens who were depending on me for survival guidance and coordination. I spent the morning trying to find alternatives that would allow me to help my family without abandoning the survivors I was coordinating. I contacted every group within range to ask if anyone had vehicles or equipment capable of making the journey to Golden. I explored the possibility of coordinating a search mission that could locate my family while also establishing contact with survivor groups in that area. I investigated whether any of the survivors I was already helping had the skills and resources to take over coordination duties if I left temporarily. None of these alternatives proved feasible. The survivor groups I was coordinating were struggling with their own transportation and equipment limitations. Most had vehicles that couldn't handle the road conditions, and those that did have capable equipment couldn't spare the fuel for a mission that might not succeed. The areas where my family had been spotted were beyond the range of reliable radio communication, which meant a search mission could easily become lost or stranded without any way to call for assistance. October 15th also brought the crisis that forced immediate action regardless of my family situation. My fuel reserves for the generator powering my radio equipment dropped to critical levels. The diesel generator that had been running continuously for over 2 weeks was consuming approximately 15 gallons per day, and my emergency supply was down to less than 30 gallons. At current consumption rates, I had perhaps 48 hours of power remaining before my entire communication system would shut down. This fuel crisis had implications far beyond my personal situation. The control tower where I was operating had become the primary communication hub for emergency coordination across a region where all other systems had failed. If my equipment stopped working, dozens of survivor groups would lose their connection to each other and to the coordination that was helping them solve critical survival problems. People would die because they couldn't get guidance for medical emergencies, route planning, or resource sharing. The nearest fuel sources were at abandoned gas stations and airport facilities scattered across the metro area, but accessing them would require leaving my position and traveling through conditions that were extremely dangerous. Airport fuel supplies were probably frozen or contaminated by now, and gas stations would likely have been drained by other survivors or would have fuel that was too old to be reliable. Even if I could locate usable fuel, transporting it back to the tower would require equipment and assistance I didn't have. October 16th brought the weather forecast that eliminated any remaining options for delay. The National Weather Service, broadcasting from one of the few facilities still operational, predicted the most severe conditions yet for the following week. Temperatures were forecast to drop into the -30 range with sustained winds exceeding 50 miles per hour. These conditions would create wind chill factors that could cause frostbite within minutes and death from exposure within an hour. More significantly for my coordination efforts, the forecast included a severe ice storm that would make any form of ground travel completely impossible for several days. Roads that were already barely passable would become sheets of ice that would trap vehicles and prevent any movement between survivor locations. The storm was expected to arrive within 72 hours, which meant that any major operations or movements had to be completed before then. The ice storm prediction fundamentally changed the timeline for every decision I was facing. If I was going to search for my family, it had to happen within the next 2 days, or the opportunity would be lost for weeks, or possibly months. If the survivor groups I was coordinating needed to make any changes to their locations or arrangements, those moves had to be completed before the storm arrived. If I was going to relocate my own operations to a more sustainable position, the move had to happen immediately. The complexity of coordinating these decisions simultaneously while operating on minimal sleep and maximum stress was overwhelming. I was trying to plan a potential search mission for my family, while also coordinating supply transfers between survivor groups, managing a medical emergency involving a woman going into premature labor, and developing contingency plans for maintaining communications after my fuel ran out. October 17th forced the decision that defined everything that followed. The Aurora Community Center, where I'd helped consolidate 32 survivors, reported that their backup generator was failing, and they needed to relocate to a different facility before losing heat entirely. The only suitable alternative was a warehouse complex near the airport that had geothermal heating, but would require significant work to make it habitable for a large group. The relocation of 30 people from Aurora to the warehouse complex near the airport represented the most complex coordination challenge I'd faced since the disaster began. It required precise timing to move everyone safely, careful planning to transport essential supplies and equipment, and coordination with other survivor groups who could provide assistance or temporary shelter if weather conditions delayed the operation. But the warehouse complex was located along the route I would need to take to search for my family in Golden. If I coordinated the Aurora group's relocation personally, I could potentially continue westward afterward to look for Maria and the kids. It would mean abandoning my position in the control tower, but it would also allow me to help solve the immediate crisis for the Aurora survivors while pursuing my personal mission. The decision required accepting that I couldn't maintain my role as the regional communication hub indefinitely. My fuel situation made that impossible regardless of what I chose to do about my family. The ice storm would disrupt communications anyway, forcing a temporary shutdown of coordination activities. If I was going to lose my ability to help people from the tower, I might as well lose it while attempting to save both the Aurora group and my own family. October 18th was dedicated to planning and preparation for what I knew would be the end of my role as air traffic controller turned survival coordinator. I spent the day establishing communication protocols that would allow survivor groups to maintain contact with each other, using equipment and frequencies that didn't depend on my position in the tower. I transferred technical information about weather monitoring, route planning, and emergency procedures to people in various groups who could take over some coordination functions. The psychological preparation was more difficult than the technical planning. For over 2 weeks, I'd defined myself by my ability to help people survive through communication and coordination. My identity had become tied to being the voice that answered when desperate people called for help. Abandoning that role felt like abandoning the people who depended on it, even though continuing it was no longer sustainable. I also had to prepare for the possibility that searching for my family would be unsuccessful or would result in my own death. The conditions I'd be traveling through were dangerous enough that equipment failure, navigation errors, or simply getting caught in the wrong place during a weather change could be fatal. If that happened, I wanted to ensure that the work I'd been doing would continue in some form even without my direct involvement. The final radio transmission I sent from the control tower was broadcast on multiple frequencies to reach as many survivor groups as possible. I explained that I was relocating operations due to fuel constraints and severe weather predictions. I provided updated information about resources, safe routes, and coordination procedures that groups could use to continue mutual assistance efforts. I established emergency contact schedules that would allow people to maintain communication, even with limited radio equipment and power. Most importantly, I provided my sister's information and asked anyone who encountered Maria, Sophia, and Miguel to relay a message that I was searching for them and would continue trying to re-establish contact. It was a desperate measure, but in a situation where normal communication systems had completely failed, broadcasting personal information on emergency frequencies was one of the few ways to maintain any hope of family reunion. October 19th was the day I learned that leadership isn't about having the answers, it's about making decisions when all the answers are wrong. As I stepped out of that tower for the first time in 3 weeks, I realized I wasn't just leaving my post. I was leaving the last piece of the old world behind. The physical act of leaving the control tower was more emotionally difficult than I'd anticipated. For 19 days, that elevated position had been my entire world, my connection to the broader disaster, and my platform for helping others survive. The radio equipment, weather monitoring systems, and communication networks I was abandoning represented the last functioning remnant of the technological infrastructure that had once connected our entire civilization. But I was also walking away from the safety and isolation that position had provided. In the tower, I'd been able to help people while remaining physically removed from the immediate dangers they faced. I'd coordinated rescue operations without personally risking exposure, hypothermia, or the dozens of other hazards that made survival a daily challenge for everyone else. The transition from coordinator to participant in the survival situation was jarring. Within minutes of leaving the climate-controlled environment of the tower, I was experiencing the same brutal cold, treacherous footing, and physical exhaustion that I'd been helping others navigate through radio communication. The theoretical knowledge I'd gained about survival techniques and hazard avoidance suddenly became practical skills I needed to use immediately to avoid becoming another casualty. The Aurora group was waiting for me at a predetermined meeting point near the terminal building, and seeing them in person after weeks of radio-only contact was both reassuring and sobering. These were people I'd helped guide through multiple crises, whose voices I knew as well as those of my own family members, but whom I'd never actually met face to face. The physical reality of their condition, the exhaustion, the improvised cold weather gear, the visible signs of prolonged stress and malnutrition made the severity of our situation more concrete than any radio report could have conveyed. Leading 30 people through conditions that could kill anyone who made a serious mistake was a responsibility unlike anything I'd experienced as an air traffic controller. When I guided aircraft through dangerous weather, the pilots were trained, professionals with sophisticated equipment and established procedures for handling emergencies. The people I was now leading included elderly individuals, children, and adults with no experience in extreme survival situations, equipped with whatever cold weather gear they'd been able to improvise or scavenge. The route from Aurora to the warehouse complex near the airport required navigating through areas where abandoned vehicles created obstacles, where ice made footing treacherous, and where wind exposure could cause frostbite within minutes. Had to balance the need to move quickly enough to reach shelter before weather conditions deteriorated against the need to move slowly enough that everyone in the group could keep up safely. The psychological challenge of personal leadership was different from the remote coordination I'd been providing from the tower. When people were struggling with fear, exhaustion, or despair, I had to provide encouragement and motivation while managing my own stress about finding my family. When someone fell or was injured, I had to make immediate decisions about whether to stop and provide care or continue moving to prevent the entire group from being caught in dangerous conditions. The warehouse complex we reached after 6 hours of careful travel was both better and worse than I'd hoped. The geothermal heating system was functioning, which meant the space could be kept warm enough for survival even in extreme cold. The building was structurally sound and large enough to accommodate the group with room for additional survivors if necessary. There were loading docks and vehicle access that would facilitate supply operations if road conditions improved. But the facility had obviously been abandoned for weeks, and making it habitable required work that would take days. Windows were broken, allowing snow and wind inside. The electrical system was partially functional, but needed significant repairs to provide reliable lighting and power for essential equipment. Water pipes had frozen and burst, creating flooding in some areas and eliminating running water throughout the building. Establishing basic shelter and safety systems for 30 people in a partially destroyed warehouse required skills and labor that pushed everyone to their physical and emotional limits. But it also created the kind of focused, immediate purpose that helped people cope with the broader disaster by concentrating on specific, solvable problems. Working together to create livable space from an abandoned building provided a sense of control and progress that had been missing during weeks of pure survival mode. By evening, we'd created a functional shelter that could house the group safely through the predicted ice storm and beyond. The heating system was working well enough to maintain survivable temperatures. Sleeping areas had been established using materials scavenged from the warehouse and supplies people had carried from their previous locations. Food and water systems were basic but adequate for short-term needs. Most importantly for my personal mission, the warehouse was located only 20 miles from Golden, where my family had last been seen. The group was now established in a sustainable location with sufficient organization and resources to function independently for at least several weeks. The leadership structure we'd developed during the relocation process meant that my departure wouldn't leave them without coordination and decision-making capabilities. The difficult conversation with the group about my plans to search for my family took place around the improvised heating system we'd established in the center of our main shelter area. I explained that I would be leaving the next morning to look for Maria and the kids, that I might be gone for several days or might not return at all, and that they needed to be prepared to continue their survival efforts without my assistance. The response from the group was more supportive than I'd expected. Several people volunteered to come with me despite the obvious risks and the fact that my mission had nothing to do with their own survival needs. Others offered equipment and supplies that could improve my chances of success, even though sharing resources reduced their own safety margins. Everyone understood that family connections were among the few things that still mattered in a world where most of the structures that had previously defined human relationships had disappeared. But they also understood that my leaving represented the end of the coordination and communication network that had helped dozens of people survive the past 2 weeks. The radio equipment I'd been using was staying with the group, but without the elevated position and power systems of the control tower, their communication range would be severely limited. The weather monitoring and route planning capabilities I'd been providing would no longer be available to other survivor groups across the region. October 19th ended with the knowledge that tomorrow would bring either reunion with my family or confirmation that they were beyond rescue. Either outcome would fundamentally change my role in this disaster and my understanding of what survival means when everything familiar has been destroyed. The old normal was gone forever, but maybe what we were building from the ruins could be something stronger, something more resilient, something more honest about what really matters when everything else has been stripped away. The world looks different when you're walking through it instead of watching from above. October 20th taught me that surviving the apocalypse isn't about waiting for things to return to normal. It's about accepting that normal is whatever you make it. I left the warehouse at dawn with 2 volunteers from the Aurora group, who insisted on helping despite the obvious dangers. Marcus had been a paramedic before the eruption and carried medical supplies that could be critical if we found my family, injured or sick. Sarah had grown up in the mountains and knew the terrain between Denver and Golden better than anyone else in our group. Both understood that this mission might cost them their lives for the sake of people they'd never met. The journey began by following the remains of Highway 6 west toward Golden, but the road was quickly impassable due to abandoned vehicles buried under 4 feet of snow. We shifted to a parallel route that Sarah knew, using surface streets and hiking trails that connected residential areas with patches of open space where navigation was still possible. The temperature was -22 degrees with wind that made exposed skin painful within seconds. Our progress was slower than I'd hoped, but faster than I'd feared. The key was maintaining a pace that prevented overheating while moving, because stopping to rest in these conditions meant rapid cooling that could lead to hypothermia. We wore layers that could be adjusted quickly and carried emergency heating sources that would work even if our primary equipment failed. Every decision about route, pace, and rest breaks was made with the understanding that a single mistake could be fatal for all of us. 3 hours into the journey, we found the first evidence that other people had traveled this route recently. Footprints in the snow showed that a group of at least 4 people had passed through the area within the past few days, moving in the same direction we were heading. The size and spacing of some prints suggested children, which gave me hope that we might be following my family's trail. But the tracks also showed signs that worried. The group had been moving slowly with frequent stops that indicated exhaustion or injury. Some prints showed evidence of improvised footwear that wouldn't provide adequate protection against cold and wet conditions. Most concerning, the tracks showed that the group had deviated from the most direct route, possibly because they were lost or were avoiding some obstacle we hadn't encountered yet. By noon, we reached the rest stop on Highway 36, where Robert had reported seeing my family 3 days earlier. The building was abandoned but showed clear signs of recent occupation. Someone had built a fire in a trash barrel near the entrance, and there were food containers and debris that suggested people had sheltered there temporarily. More importantly, I found a piece of paper with Sophia's handwriting, a math worksheet. from her school that she must have been carrying in her backpack. The discovery of Sophia's homework was simultaneously encouraging and heartbreaking. It confirmed that my family had been at this location recently enough that I might still be able to find them. But it also represented the disconnect between the normal life they'd been living just 3 weeks ago and the desperate survival situation they were now facing. The math problems that had seemed important in September were meaningless in a world where the primary challenge was staying alive through each day. From the rest stop, the tracks continued west toward the mountains, but they were becoming harder to follow as wind and additional snowfall had partially obscured them. Sarah warned that the route ahead led into terrain that became increasingly dangerous as elevation increased. Mountain weather was more severe than conditions in the metro area, and the risk of avalanches or becoming trapped by sudden storms increased significantly at higher elevations. The decision point came when we reached a fork in the trail system. One route continued west into the mountains following what appeared to be my family's tracks. The other route turned south toward areas where other survivor groups might have established shelter. The mountain route offered the possibility of finding my family, but also carried the highest risk of getting lost or trapped in conditions that would kill all of us. The southern route was safer but meant abandoning the only trail I had that might lead to Maria and the kids. I chose to continue following the mountain route, accepting the risks because the alternative meant giving up the search when I was potentially close to success. Marcus and Sarah supported the decision even though they understood it increased the danger for all of us. We redistributed our supplies to ensure that essential equipment was spread across all 3 packs, so that losing one person wouldn't eliminate critical survival gear for the others. The mountain terrain tested every survival skill we'd developed over the past 3 weeks. The trail was steep enough that climbing required significant physical effort that increased our caloric needs and risk of overheating. Wind exposure increased dramatically as we gained elevation, creating conditions where frostbite could occur within minutes if clothing or equipment failed. Navigation became more difficult as landmarks were obscured by snow, and the trail became less distinct. 4 hours after leaving the rest stop, we found the second piece of evidence that confirmed we were following the right trail. Miguel's Denver Broncos cap was hanging from a tree branch about 8 feet off the ground, placed there deliberately as a signal rather than lost accidentally. The cap was positioned so that anyone following their route would see it clearly, which meant my family was aware they might be pursued and were trying to help searchers find them. The signal also suggested that they were still thinking strategically about their situation, rather than simply wandering in a state of panic or desperation. Leaving markers for potential rescuers indicated that Maria was maintaining hope and taking active steps to improve their chances of being found. But the fact that they were leaving such signals also meant they believed they needed rescue, which suggested they were in a situation they couldn't resolve independently. As afternoon progressed into evening, we reached an elevation where the cold was becoming life-threatening even with our cold weather gear. The temperature had dropped to -30 degrees, and wind conditions created chill factors that would cause frostbite within minutes. We needed to find shelter for the night or risk becoming casualties ourselves, but we were also tantalizingly close to what appeared to be the end of the trail we'd been following. The shelter we found was a partially collapsed cabin that had probably been abandoned long before the volcanic eruption. The structure was damaged, but provided enough wind protection and insulation that we could establish a heating system using portable equipment we'd carried. More importantly, we found evidence that my family had used the same shelter recently. Blankets and food containers showed that they'd spent at least one night in the cabin before continuing their journey, but the evidence also revealed information that changed my understanding of their situation. Medical supplies and bandages suggested that someone in the group was injured. The amount of food waste indicated they'd been there longer than a single night, possibly because they couldn't continue travel due to weather or injury. Most significantly, I found a note from Maria addressed to me specifically, indicating that she'd hoped I might eventually follow their trail. The note was brief but provided critical information about their situation and plans. Maria explained that Miguel had developed a respiratory infection that was getting worse in the cold conditions. They were heading toward a ranger station that she remembered from family camping trips, hoping to find better shelter and possibly medical supplies. She estimated it was another day's walk from the cabin, but warned that the route crossed avalanche-prone areas that might be impassable. The note also included a message that was clearly meant to discourage me from following them further. Maria wrote that the conditions ahead were too dangerous for rescue attempts, and that I should focus on helping other people, rather than risking my life trying to find them. She said they had enough supplies for several more days and would try to return to safer areas once Miguel's condition improved. The subtext was clear. She didn't want my survival to depend on finding them. Reading that note by firelight in a collapsing cabin while snow piled against the walls was one of the most emotionally difficult moments of the entire disaster. Maria was essentially telling me to abandon the search for their own safety, but I also knew that Miguel's respiratory infection could become fatal without proper medical treatment. The choice was between respecting their wishes and accepting my own limitations, or continuing a rescue attempt that could result in 4 deaths instead of 3. Marcus's medical assessment was that respiratory infections were extremely dangerous under current conditions because cold air worsened lung inflammation, while physical exertion increased oxygen demands that infected lungs couldn't meet. Without antibiotics and warm, dry shelter, Miguel's condition would probably continue deteriorating regardless of any other care Maria could provide. But Marcus also emphasized that rescue attempts in avalanche terrain during severe weather conditions had very low success rates even under the best circumstances. October 21st brought the decision that defined the rest of my life. We could continue following my family's trail into terrain that would probably kill all of us, or we could return to the warehouse group and accept that some separations can't be overcome regardless of how much we're willing to sacrifice to prevent them. The weather that morning made the decision for us. Overnight, conditions had deteriorated to the point where travel in any direction had become impossibly dangerous. Wind speeds exceeded 60 miles per hour. Visibility was near zero due to blowing snow, and the temperature had dropped to minus 38 degrees. The avalanche risk in the areas where my family's trail led was rated as extreme, meaning that even minor disturbances could trigger massive snowslides. We spent the day improving our shelter and monitoring weather conditions while hoping for a break that would allow safe travel. But the forecasts indicated that these conditions would persist for at least another 48 hours, possibly longer. By the time travel became possible again, my family's trail would be completely obscured, and their location would be impossible to determine even if they survived the storm. The psychological process of accepting that the search had to end was more difficult than any of the physical challenges we'd faced. For 3 weeks, the possibility of reuniting with my family had been the motivation that kept me functional during the worst moments of the disaster. The hope that I could somehow save them had justified the risks I'd taken and the sacrifices I'd made. Abandoning that hope meant accepting a fundamental change in how I understood my purpose and identity. But the storm also provided time for reflection that helped me process what I'd learned during the search. Following my family's trail had shown me that they'd survived the initial disaster and had been making rational decisions about their situation. The signals they'd left demonstrated that Maria was maintaining hope and taking active steps to improve their chances of survival. Even if I couldn't reach them, they weren't helpless victims waiting for rescue. More importantly, the search had reinforced my understanding of how survival works when all normal support systems have failed. People survive by making the best decisions they can with the information and resources available to them. Sometimes those decisions lead to safety, and sometimes they don't, but the alternative to making decisions is accepting certain death. My family was making survival decisions just as I was, and respecting their autonomy meant accepting that they might succeed without my help. October 22nd marked the beginning of our return journey to the warehouse, but traveling through, the storm proved to be more hazardous than the original search had been. Visibility was so poor that navigation required constant attention to avoid becoming separated from the group or wandering into dangerous terrain. The cold was intense enough that equipment failures became common, requiring frequent stops to repair gear or redistribute supplies when something critical stopped working. The journey that had taken us 2 days going up the mountain required 3 days coming down, because we had to move more slowly and take more frequent shelter breaks. But the extra time also allowed for conversations with Marcus and Sarah that helped me process the emotional impact of the unsuccessful search. Both had lost family members during the disaster, and their perspectives on grief, acceptance, and moving forward provided insights that I needed to hear. Marcus explained that his role as a paramedic had taught him that not every emergency could be resolved successfully, regardless of how much skill, effort, or resources were applied. Sometimes the best outcome achievable was ensuring that people didn't suffer unnecessarily, even if they couldn't be saved. Sarah described how her mountain rescue experience had shown her that survival often depended more on accepting limitations than on refusing to give up hope. These conversations helped me understand that ending the search for my family wasn't a failure of determination or commitment. It was a recognition that survival requires making rational decisions based on actual conditions rather than emotional needs. The choice to return to the warehouse group was itself a survival decision that acknowledged my responsibility to people who were depending on me while accepting the reality of what was and wasn't possible. We reached the warehouse on October 24th to find that the group had not only survived our absence, but had made significant improvements to their living situation. The broken windows had been repaired using materials scavenged from other buildings. The electrical system had been restored to provide reliable lighting and power for essential equipment. Most importantly, they'd established contact with other survivor groups in the area and were coordinating resource sharing and mutual assistance efforts. The transformation of the warehouse from an abandoned building to a functional survival community demonstrated what people could accomplish when they focused on solving immediate problems rather than waiting for external rescue. The group had developed leadership structures, work assignments, and resource allocation systems that addressed their basic needs while creating the foundation for longer-term sustainability. They'd also maintained the radio communication network I'd established, allowing them to coordinate with other groups across the region. My return to the group came with a role change that reflected the evolution of our situation from emergency survival to long-term adaptation. Instead of being the primary coordinator and decision-maker, I became one member of a leadership team that shared responsibilities for different aspects of our survival efforts. The skills I'd developed during weeks of coordinating rescue operations were valuable, but they needed to be integrated with other expertise that different group members brought to our collective situation. The psychological adjustment to this new role was significant, but ultimately positive. For weeks, I'd carried the burden of being responsible for life or death decisions that affected dozens of people. Sharing that responsibility with others, who had developed their own expertise and judgment, meant that I could contribute to our survival without bearing the entire weight of leadership alone. The transition from indispensable coordinator to contributing member was actually a relief that allowed me to focus on specific tasks rather than trying to manage everything simultaneously. October 25th brought news that fundamentally changed our understanding of the disaster we'd been surviving. Radio contact with a military unit operating out of Colorado Springs revealed that the volcanic activity at Yellowstone was not only continuing but was showing signs of increased intensity. Seismic monitoring indicated that magma chambers were still releasing material at rates that could sustain the eruption for months or years, rather than the weeks that early estimates had suggested. More significantly, there were confirmed reports of secondary eruptions at volcanic sites across the western United States. Mount Rainier in Washington had experienced increased activity. Volcanic systems in California and Oregon were showing elevated seismic activity that suggested they might be destabilized by the massive geological disruption at Yellowstone. The possibility of multiple simultaneous eruptions raised the prospect that the atmospheric effects we'd been experiencing were just the beginning of a much larger environmental catastrophe. The military contact also provided our first reliable information about conditions beyond our immediate region. Major population centers across the western United States had experienced infrastructure collapses similar to what we'd witnessed in Denver. Agricultural areas had suffered crop losses that would affect food supplies nationwide for multiple growing seasons. Transportation networks remained disrupted across vast areas, making economic recovery extremely difficult even in regions that weren't directly affected by volcanic activity. But perhaps most importantly, the military contact confirmed that government continuity efforts were functioning, and that recovery operations were being planned and implemented across multiple states. Emergency management agencies were coordinating relief efforts using resources that had been pre-positioned for exactly this type of large-scale disaster. The knowledge that our survival efforts were part of a larger recovery framework provided hope that our current situation was temporary, even if it might persist for months. The information about broader recovery efforts also changed how we understood our own role in the disaster response. Instead of being isolated survivors waiting for rescue, we were part of a distributed network of communities that were maintaining social organization and economic activity under extremely challenging conditions. Our warehouse group was contributing to regional stability by keeping ourselves alive and by maintaining communication links that facilitated coordination between other survivor communities. October 26th brought contact that provided the news I'd been hoping for since beginning the search for my family. A ham radio operator in Fort Collins reported contact with a group that included a woman named Maria and 2 children matching Sophia and Miguel's descriptions. According to his information, they'd reached a community shelter in Estes Park that was operating with backup power and had medical facilities capable of treating respiratory infections. The confirmation that my family was alive and in a safe location was emotionally overwhelming in ways I hadn't anticipated. For over a week, I'd been processing grief for what I'd assumed were their deaths, while simultaneously maintaining hope that kept me functional during the most difficult parts of our survival situation. Learning that they'd not only survived, but had reached medical care meant that I could finally acknowledge how much fear and uncertainty I'd been carrying about their safety. But the knowledge of their location also raised new questions about reunion possibilities and long-term family relationships under the changed conditions we were all facing. Estes Park was approximately 80 miles from our warehouse location, a distance that remained essentially impassable under current travel conditions. Even if reunion became possible in the spring, it would occur between people who had all been fundamentally changed by months of survival experiences that we hadn't shared with each other. The radio contact also provided an opportunity to send a message to Maria through the Fort Collins operator. I was able to confirm that I was alive and safe, that I'd been coordinating survival efforts for a large group, and that I would continue trying to maintain contact through radio networks as they developed. Maria's response, relayed through multiple operators, was that they were safe and warm, that Miguel's respiratory infection was improving with proper medical care, and that she was proud of the work I'd been doing to help other families survive. That exchange of messages represented a form of family connection that was meaningful, even though it wasn't the physical reunion I'd originally hoped for. We were both alive, both contributing to survival efforts in our respective locations, and both maintaining the relationships and values that had defined our family before the disaster. The separation was painful, but it wasn't the complete loss that I'd feared during the most difficult moments of the past 3 weeks. October 27th marked 3 weeks since the Yellowstone eruption had ended the world we'd known and began the world we were learning to inhabit. The anniversary provided an opportunity to reflect on the transformation that had occurred, not just in external conditions, but in how we understood community, responsibility, and survival. The physical changes in our environment were obvious and dramatic. Temperatures that remained below freezing even during midday, snow accumulation that measured in feet rather than inches, and atmospheric conditions that created constant twilight, even during what should have been bright afternoon hours. The technological infrastructure that had once connected us to global networks had been replaced by limited radio communication that required constant maintenance and improvisation. But the social changes were equally significant and probably more permanent. The economic systems that had previously defined how people related to each other and to resources had been replaced by mutual aid networks based on immediate survival needs. Geographic communities had replaced workplace relationships as the primary form of social organization. Decision-making processes had evolved from hierarchical structures to collaborative approaches that recognized everyone's contribution to collective survival. The psychological changes were perhaps the most profound. The assumption that normal life would resume after a temporary emergency had been replaced by acceptance that we were creating new forms of normal life under permanently changed conditions. The belief that individual success was possible without community support had been replaced by understanding that survival required interdependence and mutual assistance. The expectation that technology could solve most problems had been replaced by appreciation for human skills and relationships that functioned regardless of equipment availability. The warehouse community we'd established was now home to 43 people who'd been brought together entirely by the disaster, but who'd developed relationships and collaborative systems that were more functional than many communities that had existed before the eruption. We'd created governance structures that balanced individual autonomy with collective decision-making. We'd developed resource allocation systems that ensured everyone's basic needs were met while recognizing different contributions and capabilities. Most importantly, we'd established communication and coordination relationships with other survivor communities across the region that created a network of mutual assistance and shared information. Instead of being isolated groups competing for limited resources, we were becoming interconnected communities that shared knowledge, supplies, and labor to improve everyone's survival prospects. The radio network we maintained connected our warehouse group with communities in Aurora, Westminster, Lakewood, and smaller groups scattered across the metro area. Daily communication schedules allowed for coordination of supply sharing, medical consultations, and collaborative problem-solving that addressed challenges that individual groups couldn't handle independently. The network was also expanding. As communication equipment was repaired and new groups established contact. October 28th brought news that confirmed the long-term nature of the environmental changes we were adapting to. Atmospheric scientists operating from one of the few remaining research facilities reported that computer models were predicting volcanic winter conditions lasting at least 18 months, possibly longer, if additional eruptions occurred. Agricultural recovery would require multiple growing seasons even after atmospheric conditions improved. Infrastructure reconstruction would take years even with coordinated government and military efforts. But the same scientific reports also confirmed that human adaptation was proceeding more successfully than early disaster projections had predicted. Distributed survival communities like ours were maintaining population stability and social organization across wide areas that had initially been written off as uninhabitable. Collaborative resource management was preventing the widespread famine and social collapse that had been feared during the first weeks after the eruption. The key insight from these reports was that survival and recovery weren't just about waiting for environmental conditions to improve or for government assistance to restore normal services. Communities that were actively adapting to changed conditions and developing sustainable systems were not only surviving, but were creating foundations for long-term resilience that might be more robust than the systems that had existed before the disaster. November 1st brought the establishment of our first formal governance structure for the warehouse community. Instead of the informal leadership that had developed during the emergency phase of our situation, we created elected positions with defined responsibilities for different aspects of community management. The structure balanced efficiency with democratic participation and created accountability mechanisms that ensured decisions served community interests rather than individual preferences. The governance system also formalized our relationships with other communities in the regional network. Trade agreements established exchange rates for different types of resources and services. Communication protocols ensured that information about threats, opportunities, and discoveries was shared rapidly across all connected groups. Mutual defense arrangements provided security guarantees that allowed individual communities to focus on sustainable development rather than just immediate survival. The transition from emergency survival to sustainable community development was psychologically challenging because it required accepting that our current situation was permanent rather than temporary. But it was also empowering because it meant we could make long-term plans and investments that would improve our quality of life rather than just maintaining basic existence. We could focus on education, skill development, and community building rather than just staying alive through each day. It's been 23 days since the world ended, and I'm still here. Still guiding people to safety, just not through the air anymore. The fuel might be running low and the snow might be getting deeper, but as long as there are voices on the radio asking for help, I'll be here answering. Because that's what controllers do. We bring people home safe, no matter what's falling. from the sky. The role I play now is different from air traffic control, but it uses the same fundamental skills of communication, coordination, and decision-making under pressure. Instead of guiding aircraft through airspace, I'm helping coordinate resource distribution, conflict resolution, and collaborative planning for a community that's building something new from the remains of what used to exist. The work is challenging and meaningful in ways that my previous career never was. The snow is still falling, the ash is still in the sky, and the radio is still crackling with voices of people who refuse to give up. Tomorrow will be day 24, and I'll be here for that too, because that's what we do now. We survive. We help each other survive, and we build something new from whatever's left of what we used to be. The old normal is gone forever, but maybe that's okay. Maybe what we're building now is something better, something stronger. We'll find out together.